Welcome to our channel, $1 Million Made Easy. On this channel, we set up spreadsheets and run numbers to answer questions for you. We use the actual historical returns of the S&P 500 for the last 100 years, so we have 100 years worth of data to look at, and we simply project ahead what similar returns might do in the future. Now, in this video, we want to answer the question, is the 4% withdrawal rule good or bad? Let's go ahead and run some numbers and kind of explain what's going on. Let's say, for example, you've reached retirement. You've got $750,000 saved up. By the way, you don't need $1 million to be able to retire. Let's look at somebody that's got $750,000 saved up and they figure their monthly expenses they need, let's say $4,500. And let's say they're getting $2,000 in Social Security and they're taking that from day one. Okay, so what we have here, of that 4,500, they're going to get 2,000 from Social Security. So they're going to need 2,500 from their nest egg. Now, what we want to do is look at this 4% rule. Now, that's a good guideline to start with. I know a lot of people have been tacking the 4% rule, but the reason we like to run the 4% rule is because over the last 100 years, it has worked really well. Let me show you, let me update this to show you just how often the 4% rule would have worked and how it's a good place to start. Here are the actual results if we use the numbers for the last 100 years, so 1925 on there. Right now we got the 1925 numbers going forward showing. Now obviously the returns going forward are not going to be identical to any of these, but they can show us how often the 4% rule would have worked. And folks, except for 1929 and 1930, your money using the 4% rule would have lasted over 20 years. I've given this individual that does this a 3% COLA to try to keep up with inflation, just to show you. So if we use a standard 3% COLA to keep up with inflation and take out 4% from the nest egg and 2,000 coming from Social Security, only in 1929 and 1930 would you have had any kind of problem with running out of money. Every other scenario. So here, you start out with the 4% rule. What happens when you have a bunch of good years? Then you go away from the 4% rule. You can make a higher amount. You can take it 5%, whatever. What I want to show you is a difference here. Let's go ahead and do this to 5%, or 5,000, which would be 4.8%. See if we can get close to 5% here. Okay, 5,100. So instead of 4,500, you're going to 5,100, which is basically a 5% rule. Now look what happens when we update this one. Now with the 5% withdrawal rate, you basically have 7% of the time you would have failed in the last 100 years, during the Depression years, and also in around the year 2000, because these are the numbers we're actually using. You can see the down decade of the 1930s, but there was also the down decade of the 2000s. The market was down 4 times in a 9-year period there, and so that's what happened. We ended up having this kind of a graph. Every other scenario would be just fine with the 5% rule. Again, it all depends on what's happening those first years. If you start out with the 4% rule, only in 1929 and 1930 we saw you have an issue. Now in this case, you have an issue in 1928. Show you the numbers right here. Running out of money in less than 20 years. That's actually gone in 15 years. We do that's 1928, 1929. Running out of in 10 years, 1930, running out of money in 11 years. These red show us when you are running out of money. So if you see that happening and you're sticking with the 4% rule, you're still having problems in 1929 and 1930, but now we're starting to have more issues. We're starting to have more times that you're running out of money with the 5% rule. So what can you do differently? Again, start with the 4% rule. If you have problems with the 4% rule, then you're going to have to maybe cut back on your COLA a little bit. But if you have some good years like we saw in 1925, you got plenty of money left. This is always a summary box of whatever year we pick here. And if you had numbers like 1925 with this 4.96, you'd be just fine. You're not running out of money. But 7% of the time you are, and we see these numbers right there. So what could you do if you do have one of these times where you're running out of money? Let's go back to the 4% rule for just a minute and let's see what you could do differently. Again, what we're trying to point out in this, video is how start with the 4% rule. If you had some really good years, for example, 1925, you got plenty of money, then you can go ahead and go to maybe 5% or higher. But if nobody knows when they first retire what that's going to be. Monitor what's going on those first year. If you have some down years initially, for example, 1929, where you'd have 4 down years, then you're running out of money in 13 years. That's even with the 4% rule. So 1929 and 1930 are the 2 times you'd run out of money if we had returns like 1929 or 1930, which has only happened 2 times in the last 100 years. So what could you do differently? What happens if you cut back on your COLA? Let's go back and cut back on the COLA just a second here and see how those numbers work. Delvin problems in 1929 and 1930. What's another option you could do? Again, what we're doing here is increasing this by 2% a year. What happens if whenever you have a down year, the very next year, you don't give yourself a COLA at all? What we're going to do over here, right now I've got a 2% COLA going down through. I'm going to go ahead, in down years, I'm going to make that 0. So like after 1929, if you had a down year, then in 1930, you wouldn't increase it. You'd stay at the 2,500. And if you had another down year, you'd still stay at 2,500. See how that would change things. Okay, it changed it from, what was it before? It was running out of money in 14 years, cutting back last 16 years. Again, folks, we're looking at the worst case scenario. We're just showing you what can happen. Those initial years you need to be not monitoring. If, again, like we've said before, if you have some good years, you can go ahead and go up to a 5% withdrawal rate. Just monitor what's going on those initial years. In this case, going to a 2% COLA, you'd have a problem in 1929 and 1930. So what could you do? How about it if you, instead of staying at 2,500, you actually, if the market goes down, you actually cut it back by 1%. Now we're up to 18 years. How about a 2% drop? Again, it's going to be kind of painful if you're planning on 2,500 and after 4 years of down market, you're down to 2,306, but it wouldn't be devastating like you're going to be running out of money. Look at the difference, folks. Now you've got money left after 20 years with this scenario. Let's go ahead and do the same thing. Look at the 1930 numbers. Again, the only 2 years you run out of money, and the last 100 years if you have down returns like this. So let's go from having 4 down years, 1929, to having 3 down years, starting out that way. Now your money's lasting 17 years, but if we eliminate the COLA, this 2% COLA, if we eliminate that, whenever the market's going down, the very next year you don't take the COLA. Now, after 20 years, you've got your money lasting you have $30,000 after 20 years. If we go to 3%, now you get $25,000 after 25 years. And if you actually go to 4%, your money's lasting. You can see the summary box right there. So again, nobody knows the future. It's probably a good idea to start with the 4% rule. And obviously, if we have returns like 1929 and 1930, then you might have to cut back on your COLA and actually not give yourself a COLA in down years, and maybe even knock it down by a couple percent. But again, that's what happens the first few years. Monitor what's going on there. But most of the time, you're going to be just fine, like we saw right here. Going back to the 3% COLA here, let me update this one last time. Again, the 3% COLA, you'd run out of money in 1929, 1930. After these different time periods, 1929 numbers, running out of money in 13 years, 1930 numbers, running out of money in 15 years. But again, if we start changing that, when the market's going down, you don't get the COLA. In fact, you take no COLA at all. You're still running out of money in 1930, so maybe cut back 1 or 2% and see how these numbers would last then. But every other scenario, folks, look at these numbers, look at this graph. If you don't have those negative years to begin with, then you can take out more. Look at the kind of money we're talking about. What are we starting with? 750,000. Here's 2 million, 4 million, 6 million. So this 4% rule is only meant as a beginning. As you see what the market's doing, then you go ahead and can adjust accordingly. If you start out with some really good years, go ahead and increase it to 5%. But start with 4%. And if 4% is a problem because we have some devastating decades like 1929 and 1930, then you may actually not give yourself a COLA at all, and maybe even give yourself a negative COLA. For example, in this case, we'd be going down these 4 years by 1%. Instead of giving yourself a 3% COLA, it'd be a -1. You can see it, they're going down here. But that's what we do on this channel, folks. We run all kinds of different numbers, consider all kinds of different scenarios. So what do we know about the 4% rule? It works almost every time in the last 100 years, except 1929, 1930. If you happen to have those kind of returns when you first retire, just cut back on your COLA in down years. And it's going to be a little bit painful, but not that bad. You're expecting to have 2,500. After 4 years of a down market, you just have $2,400, and your money would be lasting longer. But again, that's what we do on this channel. We love doing it. Please consider subscribing. Please share this channel with others. Let other people know about this channel. Let them know we create all kinds of different spreadsheets and help you see some answers to some of your questions. And in this video, we just want to look at the 4% rule, and we're not stuck to it legalistic, say, man, you got to do 4%. Obviously, you go with the flow. If the market's going up, go ahead and take out more. If the market's going down, you may have to adapt. If we have down years like 29 and 30, you may have to even take negative COLAs. But again, that's what we do on this channel. We love doing it. Please share this channel with others, and thanks for watching.